So many home studio producers that mix their own music or amateur mixing engineers are making a huge mistake that nobody seems to be talking about. And it really has everything to do with not fundamentally understanding what mixing is about or why mixing is even a thing. See, most producers mix in such a way where they're either guessing a whole lot or throwing stuff into their mix because they watched a bunch of tutorials and they're just kind of doing whatever they were told. And in a lot of cases, this is really getting you into trouble because you're starting with a bad philosophy of mixing. This is the core of the mistake. Most don't have a good philosophy of mixing. No, wait. What on earth do I mean by mixing philosophy? Well, mixing philosophy is just another way of saying, what is your approach behind what you are doing? In other words, what is your why? And this boils down to one word: intent. The big mistake is that producers are making choices with absolutely no intent. You're putting plugins on your tracks without asking, why am I doing this? You're using a high pass filter on every track because a YouTube video told you to, or maybe even many YouTube videos told you to, but why? Because I can tell you, I don't do that, and neither do a ton of professional mixing engineers, because it turns out a lot of stuff simply doesn't need it, and it can actually take a lot of energy out of your mix if you're, taking the lows out of everything except for your kick and bass. A lot of producers approach compression similarly. I watched a video and then they did it this way, so now I'm just going to do it that way forever. You aren't actually thinking for yourself or asking what the context of your own track is to make decisions. Instead, you're floundering around doing this without any intent. In other words, you have no true purpose behind the moves you make. So, what is a healthy philosophy towards mixing them? Well, we have to first start by talking about why we mix. What's the point and what's the goal? Now, you might say the goal is to make it sound pro, but I don't think that's a very good answer, because that can mean a lot of different things, right? And that's very vague. A lot of different mixing engineers will have very different general approaches, and they're still gonna make it sound pro. I believe that mixing is ultimately about one word: focus. I talked about this in a prior video just a bit, but focus is the goal of mixing. See, a lot of people use words like balance. I need to get a balanced mix, but that's not actually what you want, because balance implies equal, or things being of equal value, and a great mix is not balanced. A great mix is focused, not balanced. Think of mixing like photography. If I take a photo of a person with a beautiful landscape behind them, then we would all expect that the person we're taking a photo of will be in focus, right? Like I'm currently in focus. I mean, it'd be pretty weird if that person was all blurred out and the background wasn't focused, unless that was just clearly the intent of the image. Focus is all about what stands out to your listener, what draws attention to your listener. So when we are adjusting volume, for example, between tracks, if something is balanced, then that kind of implies that things are all about the same volume, or they're equally heard by the listener, and that's not what you want, because that ends up sounding like a picture with nothing truly in focus. If everything is in focus, then the picture usually doesn't have depth. If I put my hand up close to the camera like this, then my hand is now the thing that's in focus, and the rest of my body is now out of focus, which means that you are now paying attention to my hand and not everything else around me. But when I pull my hand back, all of a sudden things change, right? The focus changes. Now you see this perspective of where I'm in focus, and that's different, right? Well, that's kind of like mixing with volume. Your goal should not be, let's hear everything equally. Instead, your goal should be asking a very simple question: what is the most important element in this moment? And if it's a vocal track, then your vocal will almost always be the most important, which means what? That means that your vocal is going to be in focus. But that also means that something else has to be out of focus. You can't have focus if everything is in focus, because that's not really focus, that's just messy. And that's where the photography thing breaks down, because technically you can have everything in focus, but that's a whole other thing. If you can hear everything equally, then it's not interesting to listen to, because your listener isn't gonna know what to focus on. We as creators, producers, and mixing engineers, we need to create music that communicates to our listener what to focus on at any given moment. And that changes throughout the length of the song. And there's a hierarchy of this as well. So if you have a hook, then the vocals will probably be the loudest thing in that track, because the vocals are the most important thing in that moment. But in the drop, well, things might change, right? Because now you don't have vocals anymore. So now it's more about the bass drums and then that lead line you cooked up. And that is the focus, not the vocals. This has everything to do with the intent behind mixing. If you are not thinking this through and asking yourselves questions as you mix, then this is very hard to do. It becomes a lot more like a guessing game. You start making moves without really thinking about the why behind it. And here's the cool thing about mixing, is that I could have a specific why behind what I'm doing, and you might have a different one. And that's the cool thing about creative art. There's not necessarily a right and wrong. Do I want my bass to be a little bit more on top, or do I want my drums to be a little bit more on top? We can have different approaches to that. But if you're just like compressing the snot out of your vocals, but it's a ballad, then why are you doing that? It's not a rock track or a pop track, because it might not actually be doing what you want it to do, because different styles and different genres are going to call for different treatment. So most of the music that I make, it's a little bit more on that heavy-hitting cinematic pop type music, which means that I'm using different mixing techniques than I would if I'm, mixing a soft instrumental. How I approach mixing a vocal is going to be a lot different on a cinematic track than a folk track, right? It's going to be a lot more compressed, probably have some distortion and more things like that, whereas folk is going to be a lot softer of an approach. You're going to see people talking about distorting their vocals, right? But then if you try it, but you aren't even asking the question, does this even make sense in this particular context of the track? The problem is that so many producers and mixers are doing things without having a solid and true intent behind their choices. If you don't understand focus and how to create focus in a mix, then how do you expect to do anything else properly in a mix? And this goes beyond volume. Think of EQ. What is EQ really about? It's all about adding focus to a specific sound, instrument, or element in terms of the frequency or the entire track if it's a mix bass processing. So if you boost some highs on your vocal, then what's that doing? It's bringing more attention and focus to the highs. I really hope this makes sense, because EQ isn't just this like, here, let's just take some of this out and let's add some of this in here because, we do that and hopefully it sounds cool. No, it's about focus. Boosting lows in your bass is about adding more focus to the low end of your track. Cutting some low mids on a guitar is about removing some mud so you can have more focus on the high mids, and it's going to give more clarity to the other bass elements, which is just another word for focus. I hope you're seeing the trend here. So what about automation, right? Because if you're going to automate a reverb, for example, to swell up in a moment where the vocals have some breathing room, then what's that doing? Well, it's drawing attention to the space. It's creating focus to that new moment, which is why focus changes throughout the time of a song. So if you have a vocal throw, right, then that's not just a random thing. It's actually about filling up space in a way that's going to create a new sense of focus. It's going to draw attention to it. I think that if you actually really ask yourself, if you're making truly focused decisions, that alone will help you. Just asking the right questions will help you get better decisions, because so often we don't even know what questions to ask. You might have all the knowledge in the world, but if you don't know the right questions, then that knowledge is kind of useless to a certain degree, because you won't know how to truly apply it. This also relates to your arrangement, by the way. If you arrange in a super busy way, then you're going to lack focus. If you have too much stuff just cluttered in because you just want to stuff it all in because it's super cool, it's probably going to be messy and it's not going to be very focused, which makes mixing a lot harder to make a focused track. And it's really not that hard to ask these questions. Like, obviously there's a knowledge component. I'm not going to deny that. You have to know how to use plugins. You have to know how to do different techniques. You have to know how to arrange, all of that. So I'm not saying don't learn. I'm not saying don't watch tutorials or any of that. But what I am saying is that you need to learn and then ask why. Why would I do this? When would I do this? And if you're watching tutorials and they never really articulate the why behind it, that's a bit of a problem to me. Look, I'm not saying I'm perfect here, but I try to do the best I can in my videos. I try to talk more about the thought behind things and not just so much like, hey, here's a cool random trick, right? And the reality is that nobody seems to be talking about this, because it's so much easier to talk about different tips and tricks than it is to have a thoughtful discussion around the questions behind mixing or the philosophy of mixing. But the reality is that having a good grasp on this is arguably more important than learning a million tips and tricks, because if you have a million tips and tricks that you know, but you have no clue how to appropriately use or why you would use them or when to use them, then you'll probably wind up just making choices that don't actually make a whole lot of sense. And you're gonna be wondering why it doesn't sound great. And if you think that mixing is the most important thing, then that's the second hard truth you need to realize. Mixing is not the most important thing. And if you don't believe me, or you wanna see how that's true, then you need to watch this video right here where I actually cover how important mixing really is compared to every other part of making a track. I'll see you there.